Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
Welcome to this episode of the Women in Sport Summer mini-series, a vibrant series embracing the energy and momentum of women's sports this summer, both in the UK and globally. This series is proudly supported by the Institute of Advanced Studies at Loughborough University and Spirit of 2012, reflecting a shared commitment to inclusive research, innovation and impacts. In this episode, we explore the dynamic intersection of governance, marketing and collaboration in women's sports. Excitingly, we're joined by Alex Teasdale, Director of Women's Rugby at the Rugby Football Union, who shares her insights into leadership, stakeholder engagement and the strategic opportunities presented by Women's Rugby World Cup 2025. We're also joined by Dr Dana Lee Ellis, a leading academic whose work has shaped global understanding of sport marketing, sponsorship and institutional change. From Olympic brand protection to innovation in sport event management, Dana brings a rich perspective on how marketing strategies can elevate women's sport and drive long-term transformation. This conversation and mini-series is part of the work of the Women in Sport Research and Innovation Hub here at Loughborough University, an ambitious initiative dedicated to advancing women and girls sport through evidence, collaboration and change. Thank you for joining us today, Alex and Dana. I would love it if initially you could tell us a little bit more about yourselves and your professional backgrounds. So Alex, I'll let you start.
Thank you. So Alex Teasdale, I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Game here at the RFU, as mentioned. So just in terms of, I guess, some of the things that I've done before. So I've worked across Olympic and professional sports, so in the ECB and in GB in England, hockey over the last few years. So definitely a bit of a team sports enthusiast. Moving into the RFU 12 years ago. So I've been here for a little while. Career so far really is really factored around the so what of major events. So there's a major event on. Is it an Olympics? Is it a World Cup? Is it a Europeans? You know, what is it that we are kind of hosting or that we're taking part in? And then so what? How does that really translate into the what comes next for that sport, whether it's participation or visibility, etc. So it's definitely where my passion point lies.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. And Dana.
Hi, thanks for having me. I am Dr. Dana Ellis, as you said. I am a professor at Laurentian University in Canada. Most of my research has been focused around mega events, so in particular the Olympics, the World Cup, and some of the areas within that, as you mentioned, brand protection, institutional change, innovation. We did a lot of looking at joint hosting and bidding for major events. And so my perspective on events has also overlapped a lot with people who do research on legacy. So looking at, as Alex said, kind of what is the so what of an event, not just what happens during the event, but what happens after and what is the change that it can hopefully be.
Superb. I am very excited, and I hope the listeners are, that we've got people in the sports sector on the front line on the eve of a massive event that's happening in England, and then the academic voice that is thinking through the impacts of events. So especially those of you that know what I specialise in, this is going to be a fantastic conversation. Alex, I want to come back to your journey, please. Like you've given us a taster there. You've worked in cricket for the national governing body. You've worked for Team DB. You've got this hook in on what the so what of events are. How has your career to date, and in particular some of your moments in rugby administration, shaped your understanding of the leadership and collaboration side?
Yeah, so if I touch on the collaboration piece first, so I think I'm just one of those people that it is always like, how do we do this better, or how do we move this quicker? And I feel like collaboration is a really, really key way to be able to do that. I think working in women's sport in particular can be a challenge. I think, there's a lot that it's got going for it. It's starting to look really shiny on the outside, but you lift the hood and it's still really hard going. And I think understanding that collaborative piece, there's lots of people that are facing the same challenges as you are. There are lots of people that are experiencing some of the same opportunities. So how can you grasp those and really, accelerate them? So I think there's also also something hugely inherent in sport, isn't there? If we can't be collaborative in sport, where can we be? Where things like teamwork really matter, whether that is within a team sport or that's within an individual athlete and their, coaching teams or whatever that might be. So I think that collaborative piece probably is fairly inherent in the majority of people that work in sport. I think it's probably magnified somewhat in women's sport would be my take on that. I think from a leadership point of view, again, you work in a sport such as rugby, which is really, really strong on its values, teamwork being one of those, those values, and you look at the leadership elements that sit within that. Again, it's just one of those areas where you just think, actually, there has to be really strong leadership, but it can come from anywhere. I think it's non-hierarchical, if that makes sense. I think that anybody can lead, and you can be a subject matter expert. You can be someone that's completely independent and is bringing an independent view, or can I just ask why you do that? That way. So I think for me, having spent the last 20 years working in sport, that just getting that understanding that leadership isn't as hierarchical as the name suggests that it is. It really can be about all sorts of things, thought leadership, etc. And we need to move forwards in sport quite quickly. The environment changes really rapidly, and we need a number of people to take a lead on that.
I really like how you've differentiated there between some of the different types of collaboration and different types of leadership and who can actually do that. I think that's such a strong point. And I'm interested, Dana, to how that connects with some of your research and innovation and views on that sort of intersection between different people and organisations that have the power to be networked or collaborative, and what you've seen in your own experiences.
Yeah, I think one of the points that I think is important is that being open-minded in terms of potential collaborations and collaborators is key, because I think we tend to look to those within us, to look to those where we can see the direct connections, the obvious connections, and sport is powerful, sport is unique, yes. But as Alex said, it deals with a lot of the same problems, and we see the same thing that other industries have. And the kind of growth and empowerment of women in these spaces is not just a sport thing. It's kind of a global thing. And so being willing to be open-minded and creative and thinking about how these collaborations can work for us, what they can mean, what they can bring, and then how we can take the essence of solutions that others have done or others have tried and put that in the unique sport context, and try and understand how we can make that work for us in these circumstances, I think is going to be key going forward. So I think one of the interesting things that we'll see is collaborations that might be unexpected, that might be new, that might seem off the top of your head, like maybe it doesn't make sense, but there's something there. There's some connecting element, some connecting thread that makes it make sense. And there's something that we can learn from that.
Alex, I'm interested if any of that resonates for you in the sort of live moment you're faced on the eve of the Women's Rugby World Cup in England, or indeed how rugby's tried to, across women's sport or sport more broadly, make those collaborations work or those unexpected moments happen.
Yeah, sure. So I think we're a few days away from the Rugby World Cup now. And if I reflect back probably 18 months ago, maybe nearly 2 years, there were a few of us sat in a room thinking, how can we make this event mean more for women's sport? It's going to be a huge moment over the next 5 or 6 weeks, but how can we really make it mean more? And we came up with a concept that ended up being called Elevate. And it was where we brought together anybody that we could think of that was working in and around women's sport in this country at the time, got everybody into a room and said, just put everything on the table. What are we working on? What are the things we're not working on, but we would like to? And we gathered opinion and managed to come up with, I think it was something like 83 initiatives that we could work on, which was obviously huge. What felt really good in that was that using the visibility of the tournament and the pull of the tournament, we could get everyone together and everybody shared really, really openly, and they were really collaborative, and there was nothing that was kind of held or kept. I think that we created a community that really wanted to drive things forward. we were able to boil those 83 kind of initiatives down and hand them off to people or hook people together where somebody had got a great idea, but they were missing an element that really, helped them to be able to deliver this great idea. So, the majority of those 83 things are actually happening, but we boiled them down to a key 2 or 3 as a group that we decided to take forward. One of the main things that was in there was around the amplified voice of others. So taking those ideas and talking about them. So where someone was doing something amazing, they just needed this broader group of people to really help them to talk about it. And again, the tournament to provide the backdrop to that. That was one of the things that kind of came out of this, how you bring stakeholders together to support. The other one was a piece around female leadership, which will be interesting to touch on a little bit later. I know we've got a little bit coming up around governance and female leadership. And then there's a really, really important final part in there around stakeholders, around the women who've kind of come before. And we know that we're at a really pivotal point in women's sport, but there will have been a generation before us and a generation before that and a generation before that also stood in our shoes at these pivotal moments. And just really making sure that those women were celebrated and recognised was another key part of this collaboration and this kind of broader view of bringing our stakeholders together.
As someone that's observed some of the Elevate moments, I can absolutely endorse that the community and the space you created. I think it was unique that I've seen before in sort of that space and lead up to an event. I think many stakeholders and groups can be so dogmatically and narrow-mindedly focused on the delivery of the event on the pitch around the stadia that sometimes that is not wrapped around and forgotten about. I'm intrigued to whether all 83 will be monitored, tracked, and evaluated. No, I'm joking, Alex. I'm intrigued to how it's
researchers' view. Yeah.
My
job was to get the list together. It's your job. You want to review it, then feel free.
But I definitely can say that you created a really unique space, and I think that's quite a lot of kind of what's coming to fruition now. And Dana, out of the 2 or 3 that Alex highlighted, the one that I think speaks to some of your research innovation is around that sort of amplification and the communication marketing side of an event. Does any of that, again, like link into or interconnect with some of the research innovation you've done in this space?
Yeah, I think one of the I think kind of key areas that I have interest in is what is the role of sponsors in not just giving money and getting assets in return, but what is the role of sponsors as being part of growth, being part of capacity building, being part of supporting the goals that the kind of area itself has put together. So rather than coming in and saying, we want signage, we want eyeballs, coming in and saying, okay, we want to help grow the game. We want to help support this event and next event and make it bigger and better. What is it that you need? What are your priorities and where can we help? So instead of it being a top down, having it be something that grows from where the kind of points of growth or points of opportunity are happening. And so I do think there's a lot of opportunity for sponsors to be a good collaborative partner here, to use their knowledge, their expertise, their capacity, their platform to help advance the goals. But I do think that the importance of that being something that is driven by the priorities of the people working in that field already is probably the most important element of that. So having groups like Elevate coming together and figuring out what are our priorities, what are we trying to do, what are our goals, and then being able to use that and take that to sponsors and say, here's how we think you can help us with this, I think is really interesting and provides some opportunity there for sure.
It's really timely as well, and I'll bring back Alex in here because in the UK context, the past sort of year or so, there has been a huge spotlight on investment in women's sport, building on a number of years of interventions. Alex, has that factored into some of this build up to the event or sort of your portfolio within the RFU?
Yeah, I think actually, if you look back a little further, was it 2017, 18 and 19 was the back-to-back trio of the World Cups around cricket, hockey and netball. And I feel like that was a really interesting kind of turning point from a major events point of view with those back-to-back World Cups, which was excellent. But then we were hit by COVID and we stalled a little bit. obviously really glad that we were all able to manage to go experience those events, but we had a pause moment, in there somewhere. And I think, as you say, Verity, the last 12 months in particular has seen this increased kind of focus and investment, really off the back, I think, of the Euros in 2022 and being able to, see that Lionesses win and come out of COVID and, really think how do we kind of collectively drive women's sport forward even further. I think the major events portfolio is so important in this. It's what unlocks the investment, and it's what unlocks the visibility. And obviously, we're all very grateful to government for the support that they give into that major events portfolio and sports like ours to deliver our legacy programs. We are in year 3 now of investing £14.5 million from the government into our legacy program, which is called Impact 25. We've been able to invest in 850 clubs across the country to get them ready, to hopefully experience this huge influx of, players, fans, parents, coaches, people that want to come and volunteer, which is brilliant. But yeah, we've definitely started to see that shift, I think, in the last 12 months as to just this broader value that women's sport has. I still think that we need to find ways to be able to keep that moving without having to host a major or a mega event. It is the piece that probably is a little hard here. How in a 4-year cycle, how do you keep those peaks just that little bit higher outside of those types of events? I think is probably the next challenge to solve.
Dana, is that a challenge that you see in some of your research innovation, that once the event is finished, is that from that sort of strategic and sponsorship and marketing perspective that the organisation moves on? Or are you noticing some of those shifts where they're willing to be aligned and continue to invest in a sport beyond the event?
I think it's a little bit of both. There are absolutely those organizations who are there to pop in for the moment. Especially one of my big areas of research is ambush marketing. And I mean, that's the essence of ambush marketing, right? You pop in for the moment, you take advantage of it, and you leave. And that doesn't really leave any legacy of growing the sport or growing the event in any way. But I also do think there are organizations that see their long-term commitment to sport beneficial to themselves from a commercial perspective and beneficial to the sport. And so I do think, though, the challenge is still how you keep people engaged. The engagement, the excitement, the energy tends to exist around the event. And so I think social media, when it first kind of became a big thing and kind of the new kid on the marketing block, I think people saw that as an opportunity to keep people engaged, to have an opportunity to speak directly to people at a time outside of what was going on at the event. And now social media is just so integrated into everything that happens. It doesn't maybe have that power to serve that singular purpose anymore. So I do think people are always looking, and organizations who make a long-term investment in a sport are always looking for ways to make sure that that investment is not just paying off once every 2 years, once every 4 years. And I think that's where there's the opportunity to work with those organizations to create programs, whether those are programs that actively get athletes involved, whether they're programs that are bringing fans along, whatever it is, there's opportunities there to create programs that do build that energy. And it's always going to be difficult to build the same energy. And that's true for any sport. I mean, a World Cup is something special, right? And that there's something there that it's hard to grasp onto without it. But there's still so much opportunity. People, I think, want to be engaged. And we know research tells us that people who are fans of women's sports, they want to support it. They want to use their time and use their money to support their teams, their sport, and they're very interested in that. They want to support the people who support their sport. So if we can use that to build connections in those times in between, I think there's lots of opportunity there to have benefits for everyone.
I don't know if this kind of links into what you see from an academic or a research point of view also, just on some of the things you've mentioned there. But as a rights holder, we're definitely starting to see longer term commitments from brands and commercial partners. And I think also we're very careful about the short term investments that we take. We wouldn't take a short-term investment lightly. We don't want somebody to, come in and exit just around a major or a mega event. We want there to be a more meaningful relationship and partnership there. So we've definitely seen value, and particularly across women's sport, whereby we're in this real growth phase and we need to test and learn as we go. So being able to have those longer term partnerships has been really helpful. I think it's also been really interesting to see when you kind of reverse engineer some of these things. So netball's recent announcements around the changes to their World Cups and their competitions now looking to be every 2 years because they have those gaps to fill from a performance point of view and from a visibility and a commercial point of view. So it'll be really interesting over the next few years, I think, to see how that kind of how that always on will work. I think the thing to be mindful of is how we don't oversaturate the market between us, and that we're really careful and deliberate about our growth, both through those national products and programs, the international events, but also our domestic products and leagues as well. We want people to have choice, but we don't want them to have so much choice that that we are really fracturing the sports ecosystem as well.
Can I just touch on a few things there? I think what you just said, Alex, is a perfect example of collaboration, in that if we are trying not to oversaturate a market, having these discussions with other sport organizations, with other partners about what are you doing, when are you doing it, are there opportunities for us to work together on something? We can all build some type of sport festival, rather than it just being, this sport doing its own thing over here and this sport doing its thing over here, and we're fighting over the same fans, and people might want to be at both, but they're forced into a decision or whatever. So how can collaboration bring opportunities together for things to overlap rather than to compete with each other, I think is kind of important in that aspect. And then when you were talking about the long-term partnerships, from a marketing perspective, one of the key buzzwords is authenticity. And I think that's incredibly important, particularly when it comes to women's sports. And I think authenticity is only exhibited by long-term partnerships and showing direct investment and action within those partnerships. And so if you are able to build long-term partnerships, then that's where the organizations can tap into those authentic messages of the partnership that they have with the sport and what they're doing in order to try and build the sport, and not just build the sport, but kind of build the playing field as a whole. And those authentic messages, that is really where value is. That's what creates emotional connection. And everyone's always trying to strive for that emotional connection. So being there long-term, showing support, showing action, I mean, that's really putting their money where their messaging is. It isn't just about them saying, this is what we're doing. It's about them showing it in the way they build relationships. And that's super valuable and beneficial on both sides.
From a sort of technical perspective, and I could just listen to you both all day, I feel like we're coming back to a point you raised earlier on, Alex, where both from a academic and the industry sporting side, there's this recognition that an event is not just about even the cycle that it's formally hosted in the country as the formal rights holder, but it's about the preparation of the bid and the feasibility study, and then that much more medium to longer term cycle, that in whole life course. I think there is a much bigger appreciation of where that is part of the fabric of a sports strategic plan and how it engages and how it collaborates. So going more into sort of the technical way that events are catalysts for changes, I think you're both touching on that. And Alex, you've got such a rich industry history of all those events and reeling them off. Do you often look to examples beyond the UK into these global settings? And how do you share with other partners in, say, the global rugby community about this? You mentioned netball and the shift there from the International Federation. Is there any reflections there? And that's a question I have not sent you to prepare, so I'm throwing this out there.
That's fine. I've got an answer on this one. And so, I think again, talking from a women's sport point of view, but to be honest, this is probably relevant in a broader way as well. There's a bit of a triangle that you operate within. You're either comparing yourself or sharing information with the men's side of your sport. You're sharing with other kind of sports in this country. So from my point of view, that'll be women's team sports. And then you're sharing with other unions that are in your position globally. And you're in this triangle all of the time, looking to see what you can learn from where within that. Sometimes the comparing yourselves to others in that can be unhelpful. Sometimes it can be helpful, but finding the right benchmarks. And I think there's an interesting piece which Verity, obviously you're very familiar with because you sent it to me, but where we were talking about the impact also of some of the events that had happened in women's sporting events in Australia and New Zealand over the last few years, and how you tie together the legacies and the impact that those events can have as a collective rather than individual standalone. And that would be a really good example of something that we've been able to see and learn from and take that back into, the agencies we work with, such as UK Sport and Department of Culture and Media and Sport here, to be able to say to them, look, we're going to miss a trick if we keep all just running our own kind of events. So we can do a Rugby World Cup, we can do a Cricket World Cup, and then in a few years' time, we'll hopefully have a Football World Cup down the line. But we've got to tie some of these things together and being able to learn, I think, from other places across the world that have already looked at that and then learn from each other, is really important.
So the challenge I'm seeing then, Dana, from that sort of marketing sponsorship perspective, do you think the private sector would be ready to embrace weaving and making a bit more complicated that sort of long-term collaborative runway? Or do you think that is sort of on the horizon?
I think the private sector is kind of split up into different groups. And I think there are some groups that are probably more ready, more capable to do that than the others. I think you have some big organizations that are long-term sponsors of sport that have been involved with the ecosystem and have been there help shape the ecosystem as it's grown. And I think those organizations are not only ready to be part of it, but can probably be there to kind of assist in certain things. And I think there isn't too many examples, but we are starting to see examples of sports recognizing synergies and using that and using connections that might otherwise seem kind of unusual and using that to build marketing capacity. So for instance, here in Canada, there's something called, I think it's called Ride and Glide. And it's a partnership between Cycling Canada and Biathlon Canada. And so they decided that when they were going to go out and sell sponsorship, that they were stronger together, one being a summer sport and one being a winter sport. And so they came together to create the Ride and Glide program, and they pitched themselves together as one entity for sponsorship. And so when an organization came on board, and this kind of speaks to what we were talking about filling in the time when there isn't an event going on. So they came together so that, in the summer when things are active around cycling, the organizations that are partners, they can leverage that cycling partnership. And then as cycling kind of fades here in Canada, when winter comes along and biathlon comes more to the fore, and then the same partners are on board within one sponsorship arrangement in order to kind of leverage that. So I think it's a smaller scale opportunity, talking about it here at a Canadian NSO, but I do think there are opportunities for organizations to look at synergies and package them together in ways that provide value for external partners, whether those are sponsors or whoever is being engaged. So how can we package things? How can we take advantage of synergies and opportunities that are there and use that to take things to the next level? I think there's definite momentum in that way if we can bring people to those rooms and get those conversations happening.
There's an idea, I mean, it's not a unique idea, but it's definitely been on my mind for the last few years. And I'll put it out there in the hope that someone really smart can come along and make this happen. But this is a really good example of where we haven't been able, from a commercial restriction point of view, to get something like this across the line. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if you could purchase, if I use, say, England or the UK as an example at the moment, if you could purchase a season ticket for women's sport, where you could get a couple of kind of international fixtures and a few domestic fixtures, and you can track, it doesn't have to be the same team, but you can track teams across the season, and it could be a really good introductory kind of package. Go and do 5 or 6 women's sporting events across the year, but we all end up stuck because of our commercial restrictions and our partners that are in place there, who all are doing amazing things for us and for women's sport, but we still can't quite get to cross the line. So yeah, I'm going to put that one out there, like I say, in the hope that someone will make that happen at some point in time. I'd buy one anyway.
I think you've both demonstrated that there's demands there. I won't want to bore people on listening in on the figures, but the figures of the demand are there. And Alex, at the micro scale of Loughborough University and our Loughborough Lightning franchises, we've also struggled with the exact same challenge. Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if we offered our student body or our staff body a ticket to go and watch our rugby, our football, or cycling, or wheelchair basketball and netball? But again, because of some of the restrictions and complications, it hasn't quite worked. Yeah. However, with the Rugby World Cup, we are seeing unique opportunities coming into some of the space and ideas you were talking about, Alex. For example, West Northamptonshire Council recognising that the Northampton Saints and the Loughborough Lightning professional women's rugby franchise is an important asset to them. How could they make that work for their local communities and bring together some of their events, tourism and more cultural assets to build a passport of almost experience in the local area? So I'm really excited about what yourselves and the Rugby World Cup have done about empowering the places that are the hosts, whether it's the cities or Northampton as a town, to be really creative and, to use your phrase, elevate what the event's doing. So we're so excited to be playing a small role in that around one of the games they're hosting. But the embrace from the town at that level has been incredible.
Yeah, I think local authorities are in a really unique position around this sort of stuff in this country anyway, whereby they do have the ability to almost say, what does a resident that lives here need and want? What services do they want? Do they want sport, arts, culture? And how can we package that up for them, through some sort of, whether it's public services or whether it's something else. So they have a lot of experience of being able to do that, and probably not some of the same blockers that we might tend to have as a large rights holder. So you're right, Verity, this might, it's the sort of thing actually that could be looked at slightly differently at a local level, but you need the catalyst. And for us at the moment, the catalyst is the major event.
You can say that again, and we are excited and here for it. We have had a really vibrant discussion and kind of gone more into the commercial side of collaboration. But Alex, you mentioned earlier that you also had 2 or 3 points around leadership and the recognition of some of your previous administrative, previous players' side. So I want to bring us back to more around how can we be inclusive? Because I feel like leadership and then also recognising those before us are a lot more around being more inclusive. So Alex, I was interested in your more thoughts on the leadership side, or anything you wanted to mention there around recognising your people before.
Yeah, I think right, listeners, don't turn off. I'm going to say governance, but just stick with me for a second on this. So I think that there's just this broader piece around decision making, and that obviously takes leadership into account hugely. And I think we're challenged. Everybody is challenged at the moment in lots of different areas, not just in sport, in countries across the world, around diversity of decision making. And I think we're particularly kind of prone to it in women's sport at the moment, simply because women's sport just hasn't existed in the same ways, with the same structures that men's sport has. So we have a real issue at the moment where we've got insufficient systemic structures and outdated systems designed for men by men, which is not their fault. They were there doing all the things that they thought were the right things to do. And we've got a bit of a responsibility at the minute, men and women, to be able to change that and to change that quickly. We don't have time to wait. All of that being said, I mentioned earlier, the potential for football, Women's Football World Cup in 2035 in England. What would we want all of this to look like by then? So what would we want that diversity of thought to have contributed to and led to, and what change would we have wanted to see? And I feel like there's a real milestone there, because if you look back 30 and 40 years ago, there were women sat here having the same conversations as the ones we're having now. And in some respects, loads has moved on, and in some respects, hardly anything has moved on. And that can feel really frustrating. So I do feel like there's a real line in the sand within the next decade to have made sure that we do have fit for purpose governance structures in place. We need to change some of the statistics quite rapidly. So less than a third of CEOs in sport in this country are female. And that number is declining. We need to look at why, and we need to be able to support structures and systems and the women that are in there. We know that board representation is down in sports organisations from a female point of view, and we're only talking about gender here. So then you start to look at the intersectionality that sits underneath that as well, and the dilution is really, really stark. So again, it keeps coming back, obviously, to this major events piece, but it does provoke thought and conversation, and puts items on the table that allow us to have these big discussions around how do we really accelerate change.
For those that are listening, I'm privy to seeing some of Dana's reactions to Alex's excellent and eloquent answer to my question. So Dana, I'm just going to hand over to you to any immediate reflections to what Alex has just described to us.
Yeah, I mean, as Alex had, listeners, stay with me for a moment. I'm going to talk about academic research. But one of the things that myself and some colleagues have been interested in looking at is what are those pathways that exist for someone who joins. So in particular, looking at a woman who joins an organizing committee at a local level. Now, an organizing committee at a local level is inherently a temporary organization. So most people join on a contract basis. And so one of the things we do want to look at is, as a legacy of that event, are there women who are moving from the experiences that they gain in those contract positions into then working in sport at a multiple time basis? So are they taking the capacity that they've learned from working on the organizing committee and using that knowledge and using that interest to build careers in sport? If not, what are the things that we can do as organizations to try and facilitate that pathway? How can we use events in that way to build the number of people, the number of women that are at the decision-making table in sport organizations, not just on these temporary basis, but on a more permanent basis? So I think that's one thing. Like, we have looked at capacity building in terms of hosting one event and how that makes a country or a place or a city feel like they have what they need to then host a bigger event, and then take that and use it to host a bigger event as a legacy. And so how can we kind of facilitate that movement also from people who are working? Sometimes they can be called like a games nomad, someone who goes from one games organizing committee to the next games organizing committee. And we need people to continue to bring the knowledge between those committees, but then to be able to take the next step to be in a more permanent position at the decision-making table, I think could be a very important legacy of hosting women's events. And it's something that we really want to look at, what that looks like, what's creating those opportunities, but what's putting up barriers to those opportunities also, and how can we switch things so that that is a huge part of what a women's event can do, is bring more women into the system on a more permanent basis.
I think if I was being quite frank about the ability to do some of the research and innovation in these spaces, and I hope I speak on both the industry side and the academic side, is games are a fantastic catalyst. Do not disagree with that. And there is the ability to achieve what you've both just articulated, but they are so quick. The people involved are so busy. The resource is finite. And I think that's where we just need to make that step change if we are going to make some of these ambitions, aspirations, elevate initiatives. That is exactly that. How do you see that through, and how do you keep that momentum up? I don't think any of us have solved that problem on this call, but I think we've certainly sparked, hopefully to listeners, ways in which theoretically and in practice people are trying to do that. And that leads us into the final couple of questions. So I am also going to use the governance words. I'm going to ask you both, looking ahead, what would a stronger, more connected governance system for women's sports look like in a decade or so time? Alex, I'll come to you first, and then Dana, please offer in any views.
I would have loved it if you'd thrown that to Dana first. That would have been great.
I can answer if you wish, Alex. I will just give you my.
This is a really hard question. I I don't mean this to kind of sound defeatist in where we are at the moment, because there has been progress made in the last, decade or so. But as we said earlier, not quick enough. What would a stronger, more connected governance ecosystem look like? I think we shouldn't be talking about this in a decade's time. I think that would be a really good marker, that it's just a conversation that is off the table. I think women's sport in particular is still being kind of added in to the men's conversations, and we would need to go in with full parity. That needs to be, whatever is relevant for that sport. Even if you've got women's sport as underrepresented in your sporting organisation, women are still 51% of the population. So you've got a lot to go after there. And we talked a little bit earlier around that intersectionality, and just looking at it from a governance point of view, at really how you change the voices in the room to have those different kind of outcomes. So I think there's not an easy answer to that one from my point of view anyway. As I say, I think the biggest thing is that we're not having this conversation again in a decade's time. And I think that there are some steps that we would need to take along the way to be able to get there. And I think we have to take them really quickly in the next year or two. Otherwise, we won't hit that kind of target for 10 years' time. One of the things that we're working on at the moment, we're working with a few sports in this country. So we're working with there's ourselves, netball, football, and cricket, and we've all come together both across the governing body, but also the leagues, where we have those professional or semi-professional leagues to really look at this and to create a joint voice. It comes back to that collaboration piece that we mentioned right at the beginning. So it's not just about what does a connected governance system look like within our sport. It's like, what does this look like across sports? Who are we lobbying? Who are we trying to influence? And really having that kind of joint voice around that. I think our assumption is always you have to follow your sport, as in you follow your governing body and you follow your sport. What if that looked different? And actually, what if women's sport came together in a different way? And that was a completely different governance ecosystem that we've not even really kind of considered. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but it's definitely a tough question to answer.
I think at the end you got into how I would answer that also, and I think it is about creating an ecosystem. It's about creating collaboration. I think that was the goal of the conversation, was to put collaboration, and I think collaboration is the answer ultimately to that question. What that looks like, I think, is my personal thought is, I think, looking at it and really thinking outside the box, really thinking about, where can we turn to bring in perspectives, to bring in capacity, to bring in, unique ways of viewing the things that we see every day. How can we build that ecosystem? And the bigger that ecosystem is, the better. And I do love the idea of kind of women's sport creating their own space and using their connections and their power in ways that are different from the way a men's sport ecosystem might look. And that doesn't mean there isn't interconnections. It doesn't mean that they both can't work together, that they both don't have, as I've said before, synergies that they can attract and take from that, but also not having that as the only point of focus. I think there's all kinds of ways that connections are coming together. Even if you look at kind of the online world and the physical world, there's collaboration that is happening there. If you look at, as you said, different types of sports, it's not just about growing the ecosystem of one sport, but about the sports who don't have a lot in common coming together and finding those places of commonality and using that to build together. So I think looking at the ecosystem broadly and looking at the ecosystem in a very goal-oriented way, I think is something that could really be a way to stimulate change. But I also do think, as you said, when you talk about 10 years, it sounds like it's really far away. But in change terms, 10 years is not a long time. Yeah. So So if you want change 10 years from now, that means, concrete things happening now, today, tomorrow, in order to be there in 10 years. And so I think the older I get, the more I realize time is an illusion. And so that 10 years as a child seemed forever. And now it doesn't seem that far away. So bringing people together, the events like Elevate, like you said, events that bring all these different stakeholders, whether that's industry, academia, media, sponsors, bringing people together and talking about visions and collective goal setting, and then working towards that, I think are things that we need to be doing now in order to shape what 10 years from now looks like.
I think both of you being apprehensive about how challenging that question was, I think you've both smashed it, because you've given so much there for listeners to think through. I think someone that's listening to this that is new to sport, knows nothing, will even have just recognised, Alex, that for sports working together across national governing body and private leagues is strong connection, and that's a really good step change. And then to your point, Dana, just the illusion of time. We've spoken about an event happening in a couple of weeks, which is hopefully galvanised and spark something that will grow into that medium long-term change. So right the way up to a strategic manager in a national governing body or across the sector listening to this will resonate with that idea of how do you change things in a strategic way, not necessarily in the operational side. So yes, I think you've answered that excellently, and I somehow have wriggled out of having to answer it, because I just be able to say we've got one final question, and it's more of kind of what do you want to leave our listeners with? It's what's your key takeaway? What's your call to action? You've already both sowed so many nuggets, insights, and seeds throughout this conversation. So I'm not going to read it out as a statement or question as we've sort of discussed before. I'm actually just going to ask you both, based on the conversation we've had today and both of your perspectives on some of the topics today, what would you want to leave the listener with? What's the key takeaway from this conversation? And what would you do next? And what do you want them to do next?
I think my call to action is that because sport brings passion and brings emotion, we all tend to be passionate and emotional about our part of that sport system. But I think the types of change that we're talking about, they're bigger than one sport. And so I think the importance of collective action, collective goal setting, collective strategies, I think we can't get to that 10-year goal without collective vision. And so facilitating opportunities, informal and formal support networks, and kind of thinking outside of the box when it comes to who potential collaborators are and who can make a difference. I think those are the things that are going to allow that collective vision. And I think raising everyone up together is much easier than trying to work to raise one part individually. And so the more work we can do collectively, the more likelihood there is that will be successful.
I think mine is not dissimilar to that. I think if you're a listener that is a decision maker, can you stop making us repeat ourselves? I think the evidence is there, the research base is there. We all know what we need to be doing. So please enable us to be able to do the things we need to do. I think if you're not the decision maker, but you're an influencer in this space, then I guess my message would just be keep going, because that collective voice will make a difference at some point. It already is, and it will continue to do so. But, I think all appreciating that it can be tiring doing that, but keep going, because we will get there, and we are making a difference.
Oh, again, you made my job so easy to wrap this up, because they are both just such inspirational things that, like you articulated, Alex, depending on what position you're in as a listener, you'll be able to take from. So that brings our conversation to an end. Just another huge shout out to both of our speakers today. Alex Teasdale, Director of Women's Rugby at the Rugby Football Union, and Dr Dana Lee Ellis, a leading academic based in Canada. You've shared some incredible insights, and I'm super grateful for your time and look forward to seeing you both soon.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.